guys, so art never occurs in a vacuum. It's always affected by the external world. Music in general, and jazz in particular, has always been affected by changes in technology. Like the creation of new recording methods like the LP record or the CD or the MP3 or online streaming, or the creation of new instruments, or even the popularization of existing instruments. The saxophone, for example, was originally considered a little bit of a novelty instrument used for comic effects in vaudeville shows, until the saxophonist Sidney Bechet turned it into a serious instrument for jazz musicians. And it's also affected by the emergence of new music genres. Jazz has always adopted and integrated new genres of music that were popular at the time. Jazz itself arose from some combination of blues, ragtime, minstrel dance songs, brass marching bands, and classical music. Classical music and jazz merged into third stream, 50s R&B and jazz merged into hard bop, Afro-Cuban music and jazz merged into Latin jazz. And so it was with fusion or jazz rock. So new technology allowed post-production editing. You could now cut and paste sections of a recording, add effects and use overdubbing. And there was the rise of electric instruments. Now, the electric guitar was invented in 1931 and was adopted by jazz guitarists like Charlie Christian, so they could play single-note solos and still be heard over a big band. But the instrument became increasingly popular in the 1950s and 60s with the rise of rock and roll, R&B, Chicago blues, and rock. The electric keyboard and the electric bass were also getting used more often. And of course, there was the rise of rock and funk music in the 1960s. So fusion or jazz rock embraced both of these trends. Rock and roll in the 1950s and rock in the 1960s proved highly successful and popular and threatened jazz. The most talented musicians and best improvisers like Clapton or Hendrix were now going into rock rather than jazz. Jazz was losing its audience, and so it had to respond. And there was also the rise of funk. Now, soul music originated in the 1950s with people like Ray Charles, who took gospel music and put secular lyrics to it. This was integrated into jazz with the hard bop genre, which I have a separate video on. In the 1960s, soul became more intense and aggressive and developed into funk, with people like James Brown and his 1965 hits I Got You, I Feel Good, and Papa's Got a Brand New Bag. So rock was rhythmically simple. It used straight eighth notes in 4/4 time with little syncopation. It was also harmonically simple and often used just power chords, which is just the 1 and the 5, or triads. And it often used open form, where the band would only move to the next section when the soloist was finished improvising. Funk, on the other hand, was rhythmically complex. Each instrument was allocated its own rhythm, which together created a really nice polyrhythmic groove. It was also harmonically sophisticated, with denser and more chromatic and more complex harmonies. Funk often used modal or even atonal sounds, but could also just sit on a single chord for the whole song. And it also used open form, where the band would sit on a particular groove and would only move on to the next section when cued by the vocalist. So fusion, which began in the 1960s and developed into the 1970s, adopted these elements from rock and funk. It took the sparse ambient feel of modal jazz, the funk groove, and the rock solo, and combined them all together using straight eighth notes. So traditional jazz generally used a swing rhythm, often had walking bass lines. The piano generally comped, which means it varied the rhythm of the chords through the progression. The rhythm section was used to support the soloist, and it was really the soloist who was sort of out front and in charge. It used acoustic instruments. It used linear solos, so sort of single simple melody line solos. It was generally performed in small bands. It used a standard head solo head form with a fixed chord progression which everyone took turns soloing over. It was generally functional or tonal, and it was recorded as a live performance. Even studio recordings were recorded as if they were a live performance, with all the instruments playing at once at the same time in the same room, just each of them mic'd up. So they're all playing at the same time and listening to each other, kind of like a jam session. And it used quite complex harmony with extensions and alterations. Fusion, on the other hand, used a straight rhythm with a funk beat. It also used bass ostinatos, pedal points, and vamps for the piano and the guitar. So it used a lot of repetition to set up a really tight groove. And a groove is really just a repeating rhythm and a repeating series of notes and chords that sets up a really nice sort of swaying feel that makes you want to, click your fingers and tap your feet. But the key to setting up a groove is repetition. And so the rhythm section is really more important than the soloist. And the soloist just contributes to the rhythmic groove. Fusion also used electric instruments and effects like chorus, phaser, distortion, and wah-wah. It used rock-like solos, so bending strings and shredding and the use of feedback and distortion like a Jimi Hendrix solo. It generally used large bands with multiple rhythm sections and used open form. So it had no fixed form. You just kept playing that same repeating pattern to, that same groove to set up and keep the groove until you were told otherwise, or until the soloist finishes or some other indicator or flag occurs. It also used elements of free collective improvisation. So this means that everyone improvised at the same time. It wasn't just the soloist improvising with everyone else accompanying the soloist. And it wasn't in any particular key. You could use all 12 notes. It was very chromatic. Fusion used a lot of post-production editing and overdubbing. It often used simple, non-functional harmony like triads or vamps or static, singular chords, or even no chords at all. As I said, its goal was to set up a groove and a mood, and it's kind of the precursor to ambient music. There was also a greater use of the augmented scale and polytonality in Fusion, and there was a lot of rhythmic displacement and sort of polyrhythms that were used to create sort of interesting, more complex grooves in jazz rock or fusion. So the most important part of funk, and as a result fusion, is the groove. That is, as I've already mentioned, the repeating rhythmic pattern created by combining all the instruments. It requires all the instruments to play a simple rhythm on repeat. Right, so it's kind of the opposite to comping, where you want to vary your rhythm. To create a groove, everyone has to repeat the same thing over and over again. So the bass player would play an ostinato rhythm, and the piano and the guitar would play vamps or repetitive riffs. Right, so in fusion, rhythm is more important than harmony or melody. And having a strong rhythmic groove as your foundation allows the melody and the harmony to be freer. The rhythmic pattern provides structure to the song and acts as a kind of base, or again, foundation, which allows you to explore more exotic harmonies and melodies. A steady beat or groove is enough to keep your audience engaged while you explore sort of atonal chromatic melodies or slash chords or polychords. So fusion is all about the groove. Now, fusion was largely created by Miles Davis, but it didn't just appear overnight. It developed gradually out of post-bop, on which I have a separate video. So post-bop was melodically, rhythmically, and harmonically complex. It used non-functional chord progressions and incorporated elements of free jazz. But by the late 1960s, Miles Davis was getting dissatisfied with the complexity of post-bop and wanted to return to simplicity. And at this time, Miles became especially interested in the music of Jimi Hendrix and Sly and the Family Stone. So he made a number of changes to his band. He adopted electric instruments, including the electric keyboard and guitar and bass. He added more instruments, so in effect he had 2 rhythm sections, so 2 or 3 pianos, 2 bassists, 2 drummers, and various percussionists. And he simplified the chord progression or harmony, playing songs with simple triads, and songs with the bass ostinato or pedal points, and very few, if any, chords. But even though the harmony or the chords were relatively simple, the melody was really chromatic and quite sort of complex and didn't really stick to any particular key. It was quite chromatic. It used all 12 notes. And even the harmony, I say it was relatively simple because a lot of the songs just used triads, but even so it did use more complex devices like slash chords or polychords occasionally. So for example, you could have one keyboard play a C major triad and the other keyboard play a F sharp major triad. And so even though they're both playing triads, which are individually quite simple chord structures containing only 3 notes, together they do create a bit more complexity. So in effect, Miles Davis made the rhythm sections just as important as the soloist. It's the groove that's important now, not the brilliant solo. The solo is secondary to the groove. This made his songs relatively dense through the use of many different instruments, but still quite light because they were playing few chords and were using quite sparse playing. Using these ideas, he created 2 classic fusion albums, In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew. These albums have elements of free jazz, elements of ambient music, they use electric instruments and funky beats. And they use extensive post-production editing. For example, the album In a Silent Way was recorded in a session that was over 2 hours long, but was cut down to 27 minutes and then expanded to 38 minutes by repeating some parts. And you'll notice that the songs on these albums are generally quite long. They are almost like prog rock meets jazz, a combination of Pink Floyd and Miles. So you can think of these albums, and a lot of fusion actually, as almost like long jam sessions, where everyone is just playing the same thing over and over again, maintaining that groove, and just improvising over the top, either one at a time or all together in some collective improvisation. Now, it's hard to give a fair representation of fusion just by myself. You really need to go and listen to the albums to see what I'm talking about. But I can give you a rough idea of how these ideas were applied. So for example, the song I mentioned earlier, Miles Runs the Voodoo Down, is quite a long song. It goes for about 14 minutes from memory, uses straight eighth notes and a bass ostinato that runs almost through the entire song, and a really funky beat, all to create a solid groove on top of which Miles and everyone else sort of has a go, adding their little bits of improvisation. Each of the musicians played somewhat free and chromatic solos over this beat. But they didn't really take turns to solo like in traditional jazz. Rather, they were constantly interacting with each other, playing fills, playing small solos, responding to the calls of other instruments. So it was all very interactive, like a discussion between a large number of musicians. So pay attention to the funky groove, to the repeating bass ostinato, which really, together with the groove, the beat, really holds this whole song together, on top of which you can almost play whatever you like. Any chord, any combination of melody notes, any chromatic melody or chord progression that you like. Really, you can play whatever you want as long as you have that solid groove and solid bass line holding it all together and keeping that sort of rhythm moving forward. Now, these Miles Davis albums inspired the whole fusion genre, with bands like the Mahavishnu Orchestra that played loud and fast and distorted music. John McLaughlin used a double neck electric guitar, one with 6 strings and one with 12 strings, and effectively played rock solos. There was an amplified violin and a bass guitar. Their solos had an Indian influence and used odd and complex meters like Birds of Fire, which had a time signature of 18/8, or Dance of Maya, which is in 20/16 time. And another classic fusion band was Weather Report, that used new electronic sounds like the synthesizer to play jazz. Now, they had a hit with their 1976 album Heavy Weather, which had the song Birdland on it. Now, it's a song with a great funky groove, and it's built on the G major and G blues scale, and essentially only uses triads. So harmonically, it's actually quite a simple song. Even though the chord progression is quite busy and the chords change relatively quickly, they're all generally triads or slash chords, so a triad over an unrelated or different bass note. Now, of course, fusion was so different to traditional jazz that many people accused it of not being real jazz. But this then leads us to the question of what is jazz, which is far too complex a question to cover here. So for the moment, that's it for me. Now, I've listed a few fusion bands or jazz rock bands up in the picture-in-picture, which you can check out. Otherwise, I hope this gave you a nice basic overview of fusion, and thanks for watching. Cool, see you guys, see you next time.